Okay, and our last speaker for today is going to be Dianne Ingram, who is a restoration biologist for the Department of the Interior, Deepwater Horizon Gulf Restoration Office in Fairhope, Alabama. She conducts restoration planning for resources injured in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and provides sea turtle expertise to the DOI Gulf Restoration Office. So she will be talking to us about sea turtle injury summary and restoration update. So, Dianne, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I've been excited to come and talk today. Glad to see you here. Today's topics that I'm going to be talking to you about, I'm going to give you a short overview of sea turtles in the northern Gulf of Mexico, a summary of the spill and the sea turtle injury caused by the spill. Some of that's been covered already, so I might skip a slide or two here and there. And then the current sea turtle restoration projects that are on the ground in the Florida Panhandle and the Gulf overall. Okay. 5 species of sea turtles use the Gulf of Mexico. On the slide here from the bottom left, that's the largest, that's the leatherback sea turtle. Going clockwise is the smallest of the 5, the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. Green turtles, or actually the loggerheads at the top, and then the green turtle on the top right, and the hawksbill on the lower right. Loggerheads, Kemp Ridleys, and green sea turtles nest on suitable beaches in the Gulf of Mexico, predominantly in Florida, Alabama, Texas, and Mexico, with occasional rare nesting in Mississippi and Louisiana. Loggerheads, green turtles, hawksbills, and Kemp's Ridleys in the northern Gulf also have early developmental phases in the oceanic zone and juvenile and adult stages in the neritic zone or the nearshore areas of the Gulf of Mexico. Less is known about the distribution of leatherbacks, their life stages present in the Gulf. There are for example, less than 10 leatherback nests in the northern Gulf beaches annually. We do know they use the Gulf for foraging from our stranding data. This image shows general sea turtle movement patterns and life cycle stages to help understand where turtles were during the Deepwater Horizon spill and where they may have encountered oil. Starting at the number 1, adult female turtles move on to sandy beaches for egg laying, and then about 55 to 60 days later, at number 2, where the hatchlings disperse off the beach. The hatchlings disperse out to what's depicted as point number 3 that represents the oceanic habitat for small juvenile turtles as they use floating lines of seaweed for cover and foraging. As these turtles grow over to point number 4, they move to the continental shelf until reaching breeding age 20 to 30 years later, depending on species, where they migrate for mating purposes off to number 5, and then to number 6, back towards just offshore of the nesting beaches in the neritic zone, preparing to nest again. I'd like to show this slide next of the Gulf of Mexico currents and the North Atlantic Ocean currents. In relation to the sea turtle movements we just discussed, turtles use these currents, sometimes staying in the Gulf or dispersing to the Atlantic during different life stages. All this is to say, here's a slide you saw before, is that sea turtles were in the areas affected by the Deepwater spill in all turtle life stages and all 5 species. Just a quick summary of the spill, which we've heard a little bit before. In April 20 and 2010, the mobile oil drilling unit called Deepwater Horizon exploded, caught on fire, and sank in the Gulf of Mexico. In the tragedy, 11 workers were killed and 17 injured. And for 87 days, the well discharged over 3 million barrels of oil. This was unprecedented in scope and nature. It represents the largest offshore oil spill in U.S. history and affected water quality, wetlands, beaches, birds, sea turtles, oysters, marine mammals, fish, bottom-dwelling resources, and the habitats these species need and humans rely on. The gray shaded area represents the extent of the oil, and the red dots are where oil was found on the coast, including the western Florida Panhandle, all the way through the central Gulf to much of the Louisiana coastline. Next, I'll discuss what threats the spill presented to sea turtles, including the types of injury and exposure and the impacts of the various habitats that turtles use throughout their life cycle in the water and on the land. As we've heard from some of the other speakers, the spill responders used various techniques to manage the spill. They needed to do this to protect Gulf resources overall. Some of the in-water techniques to deal with the oil included using dispersants, on-site burning off of surface oil, skimming to remove the oil off the top of the water, and freshwater releases to push oil away from our coastline. However, these actions exposed turtles internally and externally to air and waterborne chemicals. Strandings occurred during skimming and the burning operations and limited their use of nearshore habitat during freshwater releases. Turtles were exposed to impacts during land operations as well. This map shows the amount of oil on beaches. The darker the color, the heavier the oiling. I'll try to zoom in a little bit here if I can do this. There we go. Land impacts to turtles included the oiling of beaches, their nesting habitat. Impacts also occurred during shoreline protection and response actions. Many types of shoreline protections were placed on the shore or just offshore to try to prevent the oil from entering our shoreline. We used riprap, gravel, sand berms, sandbags, geotubes, Hesco baskets, that's what's in the picture here. They'd fill those with big boulders, sheet piling and boom. Some of these techniques worked better than others. Threats to turtles also came from shoreline response actions, such as the use of heavy equipment on beaches, nighttime response operations, and nearshore activities. These activities resulted in changes to the natural beach topography and beach consistency, such as compaction. And these activities affected if and where turtles nested and the success of nesting. And in fact, these response activities went on beyond 2010 all the way through 2013 on some of our beaches. Another source of sea turtle injury from the spill was the emergency translocation of nests in the Florida Panhandle and in Alabama. These were the nests that were laid in the 2010 nesting season that would have hatched into the Gulf into oil. The eggs were transferred to a facility on the East Coast, and when hatched, they were released into the Atlantic Ocean to have a chance to survive. These eggs and hatchlings were considered lost in terms of the assessment injury, which I will talk about next. Various laws and processes are in place for determining natural resource injuries from oil spills and how the public is compensated. I'll briefly talk about these and the results of the Deepwater Horizon settlement with BP in relation to sea turtle injury. First, it's important to acknowledge it's a challenge to find animals that have died due to a spill. Animals wash up on remote locations where they can't be found or they're too decomposed to determine why they died. Some are scavenged by predators or sink to the bottom of the ocean or are carried away in currents. To do our best to quantify the sea turtle injury, agencies conducted field and laboratory studies to measure environmental exposure to oil, evaluate the toxicity of organisms to Deepwater Horizon oil specifically, and to quantify lost human uses. We also use scientific literature and model-based approaches to quantify exposure and injuries where direct measurement wasn't possible. What were the numbers? This chart shows the number of sea turtles quantified as injured from the spill by species and life stage. Across the top of the chart, you'll notice leatherbacks are missing from it. Scientists were unable to quantify the injury to this species because leatherbacks are present in the Gulf in such low numbers. In terms of the numbers, there were 35,000 hatchlings injured from response activities, including the translocated nests and eggs. 65 to 95,000 hatchlings lost due to unrealized reproduction. That's to account for females that weren't able to come to shore to nest due to the cleanup activities or from adults that died and couldn't reproduce. 56,000 to 170,000 small juveniles and 4,900 to 7,600 large juveniles and adults were lost in the ocean from injury and exposure rates that I just talked about. Quantifying injuries to resources from an oil spill is part of the natural resource damage assessment process called NRDA. You've probably heard that term used. The NRDA process is a mandatory legal process based on the Oil Pollution Act that federal agencies and affected states use after an oil spill. Natural resource agencies determine who the trustees will be. For the Deepwater settlement, it includes representatives from the 5 Gulf states that were affected and 4 federal trustees. These trustees use the NRDA process to develop the public's claim for damages against parties responsible for the spill, which was BP, and to seek compensation for harm done. And we do that through what's called the settlement process. The process first determines the injury, plans what needs to be done to restore the natural resources, determines the costs needed for restoration activities, and finally assessing and seeking monetary damages from the polluter to pay for restoration. The settlement that was reached includes $8.8 billion in damages to be paid by BP over 15 years to address natural resource damages and the loss of use caused by the BP oil spill. The $8.8 billion includes about $1 billion that were committed prior to settlement, and then we call that early restoration, to get a jump start on restoring the injury. These early restoration dollars account for more than half of the sea turtle restoration projects that are on the ground now. Okay, just look at the red here. The settlement occurred in 2016, so we've had 3 years to set up the structure of the trustee implementation groups and the restoration categories for spending the restoration funds, and to get some restoration projects on the ground, including restoration projects that benefit sea turtles. You can see the NRDA allotment here for sea turtle restoration across the trustee implementation groups. Totals $163 million. For Florida, we have $20 million for sea turtle restoration. That's just the NRDA dollars. So in addition to the NRDA funds, 2 additional Deepwater Horizon funding streams were set up: Restore and the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, GEBF. This chart shows the 3 funding sources, and just look at the red there. The NRDA that I just talked about at $8.8 billion. Restore Act, which is set up for restoration of sustainable Gulf environment and economy at $5.3 billion. And the GEBF that's administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to remedy harm to natural resources injured by the spill at $2.5 billion. This slide summarizes the number of projects underway so far, and the amount and the types of projects for sea turtle restoration. There are 15 restoration projects that are awarded or underway now. They total about $88.5 million of that $163 million. The projects focus on where we can address current threats that sea turtles are under in order to restore their injury to the turtles caused by the spill. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the in-water projects that are on the ground for sea turtle restoration. Then I'll talk about projects that are benefiting the nesting beach. In-water projects that are funded include enhancements to sea turtle response networks Gulf-wide. And additionally, there are some projects benefiting specifically Mississippi and Florida. Also, gear monitoring and outreach efforts Gulf-wide that address the use of TEDs, which are turtle excluder devices, and other gear required on fishing boats, including several projects that additionally benefit Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. There's also a sea turtle movement study on the ground in Alabama to guide future restoration in that state. I forgot to mention, of the 15 current sea turtle project restorations that are on the ground, about 1/3 of those benefit the Florida Panhandle directly. Let's see, the nesting protection projects that are underway that are included in that 15 are projects that implement nesting beach protection, such as addressing impacts from artificial lighting, predators, and funding for land acquisition of high-density nesting beaches, and nest monitoring program enhancements in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Some specific examples of projects that are underway to restore turtles in the Florida Panhandle. There's a great big project during early restoration that I mentioned a little bit ago, the Sea Turtle Early Restoration Project with NRDA funds. It's a $45 million project with Gulf-wide benefits, but specific to Florida, Florida used these funds to hire a new sea turtle stranding position in Northwest Florida in July of 2017. It's the first time Florida will have a sea turtle stranding and salvage network position based in the Panhandle. Other benefits include stranding response equipment and training workshops to review methods and strategies for collecting and reporting data on stranded turtles. Another project through the GEBF funds at $6.2 million is the enhancement of sea turtle stranding response capacity. And this project establishes a dedicated sea turtle necropsy facility with staffing for a 10-year project period. The project builds on existing Florida sea turtle stranding and salvage network and data management programs, and the mortality data gathered through these increased necropsy and pathology efforts will facilitate improvements to management and enforcement strategies in the future for sea turtles. Some examples of on-the-ground projects in the Florida Panhandle on the nesting beach include improving dark beaches projects. That's about $19 million total, 9.5 from each funding source, the NRDA and the GEBF programs. These projects address artificial lighting impacts that disorient turtles on targeted nesting beaches by conducting assessments and light point sources and sky glow lighting, retrofitting fixtures by willing participants, an updated techniques manual for lighting, retrofitting, and holding lighting workshops for municipalities. The last project listed there, it establishes a work group to identify predation hotspots to prioritize when and where to conduct predation management activities for protecting sea turtle nesting beaches, including in the Panhandle. This is a $4 million project getting underway with GEBF funds. So the take-home messages, there are 5 species of sea turtles that were injured in the Deepwater Horizon spill, and including all life stages. 3 Deepwater Horizon funding sources were set up to restore their injuries from the spill. $163 million is allocated towards sea turtle restoration through the NRDA settlement. $88.5 million spent so far from combined leveraging the NRDA funds and the GEBF funds. And some of these projects are benefiting the Florida Panhandle sea turtles directly. Thank you for your interest and support for sea turtles and for listening. I have one more slide here with some websites for resources. If what I presented here is information you want to keep track of, those are 4 websites to help you do that. You can take a picture, and I have a few handouts of this if you want to pick one up. So, thank you very much.